and welcome to Chapter 26 of Traditions and Encounters, Africa and the Atlantic World. So this really talks about Africa in this period of Western imperialism. First up is African politics and societies in early modern times. So there were many states in Africa, but they were primarily in West Africa and East Africa. One major empire was the Songhai Empire, and this was the dominant power of West Africa, and it replaced the Mali Empire as we learned before. Soon the Songhai emperor had expanded the empire and created an elaborate administrative system, so a bureaucracy for government. They also had a powerful army and even an imperial navy to help protect themselves at sea. At this time, Muslim emperors were predominantly prevalent in West Africa, and they engaged in the prosperous trans-Saharan trade. The fall of Songhai eventually came by the Moroccan army, so this was an army from modern-day Morocco, and after the Moroccan army took down this empire, it became a series of small regional kingdoms, and soon city-states emerged in these new areas that were originally part of the Songhai Empire. So over in East Africa, there was the decline of Swahili city-states, so Vasco da Gama from Portugal, as we saw earlier, forced the ruler of these states to pay tribute, and eventually this drained the wealth, and the Portuguese naval fleet eventually subdued all the Swahili states, and with trade disrupted, of course, Swahili was really heavily dependent on trade. The Swahili ended up declining. So as mentioned in a previous video, Portugal had sort of jumped into this lead for Western imperialism. And in addition to Henry the Navigator, there was also this other Portuguese general who was really influential, and his name was Afonso de Albuquerque. And Albuquerque was this great conqueror and statesman, and he was sort of this empire builder. So he had a threefold plan, and it basically wanted to, 1, combat Islam, because Islam was spreading rapidly at this time. 2, spread Christianity, of course, because Portuguese was a Catholic nation. And also 3, securing the trade of spices by establishing a Portuguese Asian empire, so they could become rich and well-off financially. But in addition to these 3 things, Portugal also wanted to expand kingdoms in Central Africa and South Africa. And one of these was Congo. So Congo was this powerful kingdom of Central Africa, and in 1482 they were able to establish diplomatic and commercial relations with Portugal. Portugal was so influential that the kings of Congo eventually even converted to Christianity, and one of these kings was King Afonso, sort of renaming himself after this great conqueror of Portugal. Also, Congo was known for its big slave raiding states, so Portugal, they traded textiles, weapons, and advisors for Congolese gold, silver, ivory, and slaves, so there was this big slave trade in Africa even before other Europeans came in. Also, the slave trade undermined the king's authority of Congo because the king sort of had to listen to what the Europeans wanted with the slaves. So they were in a subordinate position. Also, these deteriorated relations eventually led to war, and the Congo king eventually even got decapitated because he couldn't protect himself in his country. Another kingdom of this time was Ndongo, and this is modern-day Angola, so this is sort of like West Central Africa. And this attracted, once again, many Portuguese slave traders. There was this famous leader of them, Queen Nzinga, and she led this spirited resistance to the Portuguese. So finally we see a woman take a big role in history as well. So Nzinga was able to block the Portuguese advances into their territory, but couldn't expel them entirely. So a Portuguese influence and colony was still felt in this area. Southern Africa was dominated by regional kingdoms, so sort of decentralized, and one of these was Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe was really famous for having a lot of wealth. And Europeans in South Africa soon developed South Africa into a country we know today as well. So first the Portuguese came, and then Dutch mariners landed at the Cape of Good Hope, so that's the most southern tip of the African continent. And these Dutch mariners even built a trading post at Cape Town in 1652. So famous city there today. Later, South Africa became a prosperous European colony as well. Islam and Christianity sort of had this dual battle in early modern Africa. So Islam was really popular in the West Africa states and Swahili city-states, of course, because of the Islamic traders of East Asia. So universities were established, such as in places like Timbuktu and Mali. Also, Islam blended with indigenous beliefs, so a syncretic Islam arrived. One group that really practiced Islam heavily was the Fulani. They were a native indigenous group. They were this West African tribe, and they observed a really strict form of Islam. So they were really fundamental. They weren't really syncretic much. They really just followed everything that the missionaries of Islam told them. Christianity also reached sub-Saharan Africa through Portuguese merchants, as said earlier, because of Catholicism. It also blended with traditional beliefs, so syncretism seen once again. And Congo was, of course, probably the most notable instance of this Christianity. Social change in early modern Africa existed as well, so kinship and clans in the traditional African setting remain unchanged at the local level. So still, there were organizations of chiefs and villages around them. But one difference was American food crops, as a result of the Columbian exchange, rapidly changed the diets. So manioc, maize, peanuts, they all came to Africa and diets changed as well. And as a result of these new diets, population growth in sub-Sahara grew rapidly as well. Congo may have made the African slave trade a big deal, but the Atlantic slave trade is really the slavery we sort of associate with Africa today. So slavery, as mentioned, was common in traditional Africa. Slaves were typically war captives, criminals, or outcasts, so not really your normal people. And these slaves were generally cultivators, although some were in high positions such as administrators or soldiers. And because in Africa all land was held in common, slaves were sort of like a measure of power and wealth. So the more slaves you had, the more power and wealth you had. Slaves, often over periods of years, they would assimilate into their master's kinship groups, even earning freedom in some cases and sort of just becoming like part of the clan. The Islamic slave trade was really well established throughout Africa, so there were many slaves shipped in by the Islamic traders and merchants, and Europeans basically just used these existing networks to build their own slave trade, and they expanded it greatly. Human cargoes. So the early slave trade, of course, was started by the Portuguese. And at first, there weren't too many slaves being shipped to Iberia, but soon after, African slaves were starting to be shipped to the sugar plantations on Atlantic islands because sugar was really, really profitable there, and they needed a really cheap labor force. Portugal, of course, also imported slaves to their new colonies, most notably Brazil. And of course, Spanish settlers shipped African slaves to the Caribbean, Mexico, Peru, and Central America, basically all their colonies. And English colonists, soon as we know the story of American slavery, brought slaves to North America in the early 17th century, so 1600s. Triangular trade. So this was really a big part of the Columbian exchange. It was kind of like the complete Columbian exchange, and there were 3 legs of this voyage that sort of exemplified this trade. So the first one was European goods would be traded for African slaves. So all the manufactured products and steel and guns that Europe had, they would trade them to Africa in exchange for slaves so they could take those somewhere else. So this is the first part of the slave trade and the first part of the triangular trade as well. And then once in Africa, slaves were captured, bought, and traded in the Caribbean for sugar or molasses. And so this is the second leg of the triangle. And in America, American produce such as rum created from the sugar or molasses and other natural resources and goods would be shipped and traded back to Europe, further creating the third part of the triangular trade. So this is Europe right here, Africa, Americas. Sorry, that's really horribly drawn. But as you can see, basically this trade forms a triangle. At every stage of the slave trade, there were lots of brutal acts of violence, so usually the raids for slaves, just normal villages raiding for slaves, it was really violent. And then once slaves were captured, they were forced to march to the coast for transport. So like if they were in Central Africa, they would have to march all the way to West Africa, where generally the slave cells were before they were sold. Also, there was the dreaded Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage is actually one of the legs of the triangular trade, as seen here. And this was so bad that between 25 and 50% of the slaves who were traveling over to the Americas died. So obviously, not all the slaves captured were able to be put to work. The impact of the slave trade in Africa. So The volume of the Atlantic slave trade increased dramatically after 1600 because of more colonies and more cash crops needed to be planted. So this really affected different populations. It had a profound impact on African societies. So there was an uneven impact. Some societies were not raided by slave holders, and so these societies profited, and they even continued to thrive off the slave trade by capturing other tribes to sell them into slavery. It distorted African sex ratios, so most slaves were males because, of course, they could do more of the heavy lifting work and the stuff on plantations, so in many cases, many villages were left with only women. This, of course, encouraged polygamy and forced women to take on men's duties. So more women, less men. Men kind of get greedy, unfortunately. And it was also politically disruptive. So firearms and the steel from Europe finally came to Africa, and when some Africans got their hands on these new weapons, it fostered conflict and violence between peoples. There was the slave coast called Dahomey, and it grew as a powerful slave raiding state. Basically, they thrive by capturing other people and putting them into slavery. The African Diaspora, so the spread of Africa outward. Plantation societies, so cash crops were introduced to fertile lands of the Caribbean in the early 15th century, so first Hispaniola, that's where Columbus first landed, then eventually to Brazil and Mexico as well, other colonies. Important cash crops that really needed these slaves were sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, cotton, and coffee, basically luxury goods at this time that could sell for a lot of money around the world and back in Europe. And these plantations, of course, were heavily dependent on slave labor. Plantations were also racially divided, as we saw with the different pyramids in Spanish society, the hierarchy with the mestizos and others. And in many cases, there were 100 or more slaves with only a few white supervisors. Also, high death rates. So if you were lucky enough to survive the dreaded Middle Passage, you could still be worked to death in places such as the Caribbean and Brazil. And because these conditions, working like so many hours in the hot sun, it caused so many deaths, there had to be this continued importation of slaves through the Middle Passage. And since there were lots of slaves, they were sort of seen as easily replaceable goods. Resistance to slavery was widespread as well. So slaves, sometimes they would sabotage work by working slowly or even escaping in some instances. Slave revolts were rare, though, and they were brutally suppressed by plantation owners, so if you participated, you might be hanged. But in some cases, slaves did revolt, and they were successful, such as the French colony of Saint-Dominique. In 1793, they actually abolished slavery, and that became the modern Free State of Haiti. African American cultural traditions grew as well. So African and Creole languages formed. Creole was basically this blending of several African languages with the language of the slaveholder, so slaves could sort of communicate secretly. These slaves were from many tribes, and because they lacked a common language, speaking Creole could help unite them. African American religions occurred as well, so African American Christianity, it was basically Christianity with a syncretic twist, and rituals and beliefs such as drumming, animal sacrifice, magic, and sorcery back from Africa were carried over to the Americas as well. Other traditions include cuisine, weaving, and pottery, all unique elements still present today. The end of the slave trade eventually was caused by Enlightenment ideals, we'll get to that later soon as well, and the abolition of slavery, and new voices and ideas against slavery. So around this time, eventually, there was the American and French Revolution, and as a result, people started questioning the ethicality of slavery and whether it was good or not. One freed slave, Equiano, actually wrote a bestseller that was an autobiography. Slavery also became increasingly costly, so slave results were more dangerous, and they were also expensive as well. And eventually, the decline of sugar price and rising costs of slaves sort of made it uneconomical. Manufacturing industries were also profitable, so some manufacturing went to Africa, and so they didn't need to capture people and send them to a whole different continent anymore. Eventually, most European states abolished the slave trade, and countries such as Britain tried to stop it as well. And the abolition of slavery followed slowly, so the British were the first, followed by the French in 1865 in the United States, of course, with the Civil War. You'll learn about that more in APWH. And finally, the last one was 1888 in Brazil. So finally, changes and good stuff for slaves. So in conclusion, this has been Chapter 26, Africa and the Atlantic World, really talking about Western imperialism and the story of slavery. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.